Mother Nature gives birth to all things. That's the idea that's expressed in this image. So the Virgin Mary is standing for Mother Nature. Out of Mother Nature arises order and tradition. That's true for primates like chimpanzees as much as it's true for us. Any social animals that are grouped together have to form an orderly structure that they can inhabit together, that defines their boundaries and their goals, because otherwise they fight each other to the death. So in the state of untrammeled nature, as Hobbes pointed out, it's every man for himself. And without the order that tradition brings, there's nothing but chaos. And chaos is murderous and unproductive. And there's a problem with order. If you look at the history of the 20th century, it's a toss-up whether Mother Nature has been harder on us or whether our governmental traditions have been harder on us. You know, of course, that the dictatorship of Hitler killed 6 million Jews, 120 million people in the Second World War. You may not know that the Stalinist dictatorships in the Soviet Union killed an estimated 60 million people in internal repression, not counting those people who died in the Second World War. And the internal repression that characterized Mao's communist China killed 100 million people. And so the problem with tradition is that sometimes it's a wise king, and sometimes it's a king that eats its own sons, which means that although we need tradition to guide us and to structure even the manner in which we perceive the world, our traditions can become archaic and outdated and cruel and inhuman. And as a consequence, they can pose a worse threat to us than chaos itself. Nature, or chaos, is exactly the same dichotomous structure. The figure on the left is a Medusa, or a Gorgon. If you look at a Medusa, as you probably already know, you turn to stone. The reason you turn to stone is because when you look upon nature or chaos without your normal veils, it paralyzes you physiologically. Just like a prey animal like a rabbit is terrified if it sees a wolf. For millions of years, human beings were prey animals. We were probably prey animals for large reptiles, which accounts, for example, for the reason that it appears that primates like us are naturally afraid of predatory reptiles. If you're in the presence of something that violates your assumptions of safety, you'll freeze. You freeze so that the thing that might eat you can't see you. And that's what turns you to stone. That's nature and its terrible aspect. And the terrible aspect of nature can freeze everyone. And you can be sure, and will be seldom taught, that you will encounter that at some point in your life. The primary Buddhist dictum is that life is suffering. And what does that mean? It means that because you're finite and you're surrounded by something that's absolute, in a sense you're in a battle that you can never win. Because there's always more of what it is that you're trying to contend with than there is with you. And worse than that, and it's for this reason that tyrannies can't last, is that the thing that you're contending with isn't even static. It keeps changing. So that what worked for you yesterday won't necessarily work for you tomorrow. This is an alchemical version of the Taoist yin and yang symbol, and basically it says something that's more sophisticated and complex. It says that the world's made up of chaos and order, things that you can predict and understand and things that you can't predict and can't understand. And inside the order there's some chaos, and inside that chaos there's some order, and inside that order there's some chaos, and so on and so forth. And equally the case for order. You have Mother Nature, representation of chaos, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. You have a representation of the Great Father. That's security and tyranny, two things you'll always have to contend with. And finally, in this representation, you have a representation of the individual, at least a Christian representation of the individual, and that's Christ. And it's a terrifying representation. It's a remarkable representation because it's not a representation of transcendence, it's a representation of suffering. And it's a funny kind of representation of suffering because the manner in which the story unfolds is this. Christ, as the archetypal individual, the model for individuals from a psychological or mythological perspective, knows that he's limited and knows that he's doomed to both suffering and death. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before his crucifixion, he has an argument with God, and the argument basically is, do I actually have to do this? And the answer is twofold. Well, no, actually you don't have to accept your suffering. But you don't have to voluntarily accept your suffering, but there are consequences if you don't. Now, the Christian story is predicated on the idea that if you voluntarily accept your suffering, you can simultaneously transcend it. It's a remarkable philosophy, and it's also something that we have very good support for from a psychological perspective. So, for example, if I'm treating someone who has an anxiety disorder, a panic disorder, who can't go out of their house without their heart rate elevating and without collapsing into a panic-stricken heap, without visiting the emergency ward every time their heart rate accelerates, every time they're in a subway, or every time they're in a mall, so they're so terrified of existence they can't even get out of their house. The way you cure that person is by getting them to voluntarily approach the things that they're afraid of. And it turns out that physiologically, if I force you to accept a certain kind of challenge, your body will go into emergency preparation mode and you'll become stressed, and that stress will cause you physiological damage, including brain damage if it's sustained for long enough. But if I present you with the same challenge and you accept it voluntarily, your brain doesn't produce stress hormones and completely different physiological systems kick in. And what that means is that people have evolved two modes for dealing with the unknown. One is voluntary approach, and the other is panic-stricken paralysis and flight. In this representation, you can see that there are crowds of people standing in the wings of the open statue, looking at the crucified individual. It's a very strange thing, but you know, you still see this. You still see people doing things like this that they don't notice. I went to a museum in New York, and there were a very large number of paintings there from the late Renaissance, and they were all religiously themed, like medieval paintings, except they featured recognizable individuals. And people had come from all over the world to look at those paintings. They were extremely valuable paintings. You know, they were painted by Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, and each of them was probably valued for reasons that are very difficult to understand at something approximating hundreds of millions of dollars. The late Renaissance was the first time in human history where human beings dared to presume that sacred images could be given an individual human face. And that idea was actually what launched the Enlightenment and launched the development of modern culture. The late Renaissance thinkers, the artists in particular, were the first people to posit that there was some direct relationship between these sacred images and actual people. And people come from all over the world to look at these paintings, even though they don't understand what they mean. I want to show you some images that describe how the idea of the suffering individual developed and what that means. The first thing I want to show you is this picture of St. George and the Dragon. Now, you know the main street that runs through the university is named after St. George, right? This is a very old image. The oldest story we know, which is a Mesopotamian creation myth, features a god who confronts a reptilian monster and makes the world as a consequence of the conflict. He faces her, she's terrifying, he cuts her up into pieces, and out of the pieces he makes the world. Now the Mesopotamians, 5,000 years ago, were trying to figure out what the nature of individuality was and what the nature of consciousness was. And their presupposition, which was dramatized, because these people told stories, they didn't think the way we think in explicit, philosophical, logical, with philosophical processes. They thought in stories, which is a natural way for people to think. They came to the conclusion that the object of their ultimate worship was the God who confronted the dragon of chaos, cut it into pieces, and made the world. And that idea has echoed down through the ages. It's an idea that human beings have never lost. Now this idea is very interesting. So you see the castle in the background. Now we already know what the castle stands for. The castle stands for order. And it's a multi-walled castle because everyone's protected by multiple walls. But those walls are constantly breached. Now young people, especially modern young people, are often very cynical about the traditions that they inhabit. They're cynical about them because they see the fact that the world is theoretically devolving into some kind of environmental catastrophe. And they're cynical because there's still war and because there's still hunger. They're cynical because often the people who are teaching them the traditions don't seem to believe in them themselves. And it's very easy for young people to look at the traditions that were and to notice the breaks. But the truth of the matter is that throughout human history, tradition has always been anachronistic and out of date. And what you see in images of St. George and the dragon is that the dragon